So, again, you're listening to Curbside Consult. I'm Harold Pollack, talking with the Los Angeles Times business columnist and blogger, Michael Hiltzik. And it's great to talk to you. Why don't we shift over to Obamacare? Well, actually, before we shift over into Obamacare, why don't you tell me a little bit about just what your beat is and what your life is at the LA Times?
Well, my beat, essentially I write a business column or a column for the business page twice a week on Sundays and Wednesdays. And my topics can be very broad. It's anything that we can define as business, and we define it very broadly. It's business, economics, finance, the financial world, public policy in almost all respects. It's rare that I'm ever told that I'm taking on a topic that's out of my diocese, to speak. On October 1st, I sort of shifted and I started blogging every day. The blog is called The Economy Hub, and it appears on the homepage of latimes.com and on the business page and out in cyberspace. And that's designed to be an extension of the column. I still write a Sunday column every week. The Wednesday column now is sort of either a best of the blog or one of the blog posts that's gotten the most attention that we now put in the paper. So my job hasn't changed much, except that the days have gotten a lot busier.
I imagine. Congratulations, by the way. I think you've gotten a tremendous amount of national exposure of late, especially with some of the coverage of the Affordable Care Act that you've done. And so that's, you're definitely one of the handful of people that people have pointed to as tracing down some of the details of things that are happening. How did you start getting into the Affordable Care Act?
Well, I was always interested in it, going back to its enactment in 2010, and in part, that was an outgrowth of my interest in Social Security and Medicare and social insurance as public policy in general. And I came to realize as the rollout was proceeding that I was seeing sort of the same phenomenon in coverage of the Affordable Care Act that I had seen in Social Security. And it's sort of an enduring problem, which is that there's a lot of coverage that's based on lack of information. Social Security looks simple on the surface to beneficiaries, but it's got a lot of moving parts under the surface, and Obamacare is very much the same. It's a complicated program. It's got a lot of aspects to it. There are a lot of moving parts and interrelated parts, just like Social Security. And what I found over the years is that if you don't understand these programs, and as a journalist, make a real serious effort to become an expert in how they work and what they do and what they achieve, then you're not really going to be qualified to report on it. You're going to be vulnerable to being swayed by ideological and political arguments, of which the ground is thick with all of these and in all of these social insurance programs. And I certainly saw that happening, especially starting in September and October with the Affordable Care Act, and just made it my business to keep an eye on it and do what I could to keep information out there where it belongs.
By the way, you mentioned that the coverage of the rollout was similar to Social Security. What were the kinds of anecdotes coming out in the rollout of Social Security that came to mind for you?
Well, it's more the problem with coverage of Social Security is more the way it's cast these days. The idea, the issues that have been raised about its fiscal stability, about its role in the federal deficit, all these things, those of us who know the program well and really have educated ourselves know that there's a tremendous amount of just pure inaccuracy that's floated out there in Washington, especially on the conservative side. Issues that are raised about the claim that there are no real assets in the trust fund, that Social Security is heading toward bankruptcy. These are all highly tendentious claims that are basically not true, or at least true only in a very nuanced way. Maybe they're half or quarter truths. And to put them out there or to repeat them without putting them in context and explaining what's really going on is not responsible. And anything you read about Social Security in the general press really falls into a lot of these traps.
One of the striking things about the Social Security Trust Fund is that people say, well, the only thing in the trust fund are these IOUs, which are government securities. The only thing we have, that's basically saying the only thing we have is something which says the full faith and credit of the United States government. I mean, if you buy a stock, it is essentially an IOU. It is saying the full faith and credit of Microsoft Corporation will...
Exactly. The dollars in your pocket are IOUs. The treasury bonds, the savings bonds in your kids' college fund are IOUs. They're all IOUs. This is just sort of misrepresentations that we see all the time in the Social Security community.
Yeah, one of the ironies is that Social Security, they buy these at a market, at whatever the market determines the interest rate should be for these. So if you're a free market absolutist, you basically believe that we're getting a fair deal in this market for U.S. government securities, and that we're earning the same return that the government of China is earning, or any personal investor is earning who buys those same securities.
Well, that's absolutely true, and the purchases and sales and the maturity dates and the interest rates are documented every year on a page of the Social Security Trustees Report, which I might add, a lot of my colleagues in the press don't bother to read when it comes out every year. So
now,
it's always a fraught moment because we know that it's going to be misrepresented.
That is. By the way, I should say that somewhere in the range of maybe a little bit over 1% of GDP is the unfunded long-term liabilities of Social Security. Now, if you express that number in dollars, it's a big number because we're talking about a country of 320 million people over the next several generations.
Well, especially if you pitch it as the present value of the liability out to the infinite horizon, then you get a figure that's 13 trillion or something. That's really only useful to scare people.
That is useful sometimes. Now Medicare, by the way, I should say, is another matter, and that really is scary in terms of its long-term fiscal picture.
Right, but there you see there's sort of a ledger domain or a sleight of hand that's always used by critics of social insurance. We know that Social Security actually at this moment is in the black. It's turning a profit every year. Whether it is or isn't have some fiscal problems, they're manageable within the four walls of Social Security. You can change benefits, you can change the tax rate. Medicare is obviously much different. It really is in trouble, mostly because of healthcare costs, which are an externality. And the formula you generally see is that Social Security and Medicare are both entitlements. Social Security is sort of okay. Medicare is in big trouble, so entitlements are in trouble. And it's this conflating of these two very different programs that's another source of misrepresentation.
Yeah, by the way, I should say Medicaid is often thrown in there, and Medicaid is much more stable financially than Medicare, ironically, because it has a less politically influential patient base, and therefore it's easier to constrain cost growth by doing various things that would be politically difficult to do if it affected senior citizens in America the way Medicare does.